There's this story about this Buddhist monk. He was a great teacher, and he had students, and every night at the monastery where they all lived, they would gather to meditate. But there was this cat that would always bother them during meditation. It would just prance around and make all kinds of noise. And they couldn't meditate. So the teacher decided to tie the cat up while they were meditating. Just while they're meditating. I know, it's an ancient story from an ancient time. It's a little, I understand. Cat people out there, I'm sorry. But just go with it. So every night when they would meditate, they would tie up the cat. And it became this tradition. It became part of what they needed to do anytime they were getting ready to meditate. And then after a number of years, the teacher died, and the students carried on the tradition. And then after a number of years, the cat died, but the students, having done this for so long, thinking that it was part of this meditation ritual, they just got another cat to tie up. Decades passed. And they keep on replacing the cat, another cat to tie up, because this is now part of their meditation ritual. And when the students are asked, why do you tie up the cat? They have now, at this point, come up with all these theological and philosophical reasons why they tie up the cat. But in reality, it all just came from a pragmatic reason decades before. And I love this story. I feel like this story is a great invitation for all of us to reflect on why do we actually do what we do? Why do we believe what we believe? Why do we participate in the communities, in the different things in our lives that we do? Why is it actually happening the way it is, right? And are some of these things unconscious? Do we have reasons for all the things that we do? And I think this is a great question to ask for us, as we are sort of at this other side of summer. I don't want to say summer's over because the weather forecast does not reflect that, right? I look at the forecast this week. Summer is far from over heat-wise. But I think in terms of schedules and routines, I speak to many of us, right? And I notice that with kids going back to school, with many people returning from their summer vacations, it's almost like we're out of that one chunk of summer and we're back into more routine, more patterns. And this is really as good of a time as any to ask ourselves, what is it all for, right? What are we striving for? What are we busy for? And I think it's an important question for us to ask as a community. Because just like in our lives, as a community, we give our energy and time and our resources to various things in hopes that it makes for a vibrant and vital experience of being a part of something. But I think it's great for us all to get curious about what truly matters, right? Like, what are we truly about? Sure, as a community. Also, what are you about as a person? And does your life reflect that? Or are we simply tying up a cat? And so this series is called Belonging, Becoming, Loving. And the reason that this is the name for this series is because both myself and the leadership team and I, we've been reflecting, and we've really been asking ourselves, what does a community like ours bring to the lives of its people? And we really have been reflecting on narrowing this down, simplifying it so we can really hone in on the heart of what we do. And these three words have really just come up again and again and again. Think about belonging, right? Think about how important it is and how essential the experience of this community is, that you feel that you can belong, that you feel that you can be authentic, and that you feel that you can be vulnerable and yourself here. But then if you can belong, what tends to follow is transformation and growth, right? Becoming. So belonging creates this beautiful foundation for us to become, to evolve, to expand as human beings. And I know that for so many of you, that is also what you come here for. But then from that place of safety and authenticity, and from that place of expansion and growth, the natural outflow is love. How can I give to those in my community and those outside these walls? How can we embody love, make love something that is active? And I find that these three words, they form this interrelated circle that if you pick any one of these words, they are deeply connected to the other two. And I encourage you just to reflect on your own time about how these words all relate. But for me, there's really two goals for this series. The first goal is for us to ask ourselves, In our own lives, do we belong? Are we becoming? Are we loving? Am I experiencing those things in my life? Do I want to experience those things? And then secondly, the second goal is when we think of our experience as a community, is Aldea a place of belonging? Is Aldea a place of becoming? Is Aldea a place of love embodied and love in action? And this is really important for us to just ask ourselves as we grow, as we evolve, as we continue to expand what we offer as a community. And so that is the point of this survey that I've invited you to check out, because it's really just an opportunity to reflect. Are we creating belonging? Do you feel like you belong here? Do you feel that you are becoming more of who you are here? And do you feel that this community offers you opportunities to put your love into action? I think it's so important that what we say we're about as people, as communities, that actually becomes concretized into our lives. Like, are we actually putting our time, our energy, our resources into these things? Because if that's the case, then everything that's on our calendar or everything that's in our budget should reflect at least one of these three words. And I would ask the same question for you. When you think about the values that most drive you, are your resources, are your energies, is your time being put towards those things? Today we're going to start with belonging. We're going to start at the top. In many ways, this is the foundation. And we've described how belonging is a human need. We've talked about this in the past, right? It's more than just a desire not to be lonely, but it's actually a need as human beings. Belonging is more than who you play pickleball with, or people that like the same obscure TV show as you, or those same crazy people who wake up at 5 a.m. to do CrossFit with you. I know that you have a bond, like a trauma bond with them, but belonging is more than those things. Belonging is about deep connection, a sense of interbeing with one another, vulnerability, authenticity. And I believe that this kind of belonging is natural. As Kathleen said, it's reflected in our natural world. Our planet shows us a deep interconnected system where everything belongs to everything else. I also find that this is an ancient human reality, that for tens of thousands of years, humans have deeply belonged to one another. And yet in our modern time, in our Western culture, it feels as though we've lost touch with belonging. How many of us see that in some way the lack of belonging, loneliness, and isolation is one of the biggest crises that we face socially? I find that there's a few reasons for this. We live in a very hyper-independent culture, which basically tells us all the time, you don't need anyone. And it's a source of strength to not need anyone. So we've so deeply lost touch with our interdependence. We also have a culture with such elaborate and extravagant technology that so many of our needs, in theory, could be met by technology that we no longer rely on one another. And really what this means is that isolating when things get tough, it becomes a natural option. It becomes easy. It wasn't always this way. Isolation wasn't an option for some of our ancestors, right? You go far back enough, no one had the option to isolate, right? Like, think about some of our hunter-gatherer ancestors in small tribes. No one could say, like, I'm not really feeling it with you guys. I don't really vibe with anyone here. I'm going to go strike out on my own. That would be death, right? And yet here and now, it is in fact an option that so many of us choose, right? How many of us would say that at some point or another in our modern day, and maybe even more so after the pandemic, we struggle with self-isolating at times, right? Sometimes we just feel like we don't belong to each other. We don't feel like we belong anywhere or to anyone. I had that experience. Junior high was a really rough time for me, and it was a time where I really didn't feel like I belonged to anyone, loss of friendships, bullying. And I remember at the end of my 8th grade year, I just had never been more isolated in my life. And And the junior high pastor at the church I was going to at the time, he reached out to my family and he asked if he could take me to lunch. And that was very unusual. And at the time I was like, oh, this is interesting. Now I look back and I was like, oh, my mom totally reached out and put him up to it. But moms are so sweet. They don't tell you that stuff at the time. You know, you find out when you get older and all of a sudden you're 27, you're like, oh, I know what that moment really was. But he took me to lunch after school one day, and you know, he just said, look, Jake, I can see you're going through a hard time. You know, tell me about it. And I kind of told him what I was going through and how isolated I felt. And I was looking back on it. I was really reflecting on this moment, especially this week as I was preparing for this. And I was realizing, you know, he didn't tell me, you know what you need? You need God. God's going to fix this. You need Jesus, or you need to pray more. He just said, you know, I really think it would be very helpful for you to find community. You know, to lean into community, to not be so isolated. And I realized it was actually very practical advice that I still think is really powerful. I think essentially what he was saying to me then, as I would understand it now, is that when we lean into community, community leans back into us. Right? And so I remember, you know, after that time, I did start to lean back into community. I started going back to that church, and I started finding more friends, and it was community that really built me up and brought me out of that. But 20 years later, I still believe in the power of community, and that's what I want to talk about today. And if Aldea is not your community, if you're new and you're just checking us out, or maybe you don't come from time to time, you don't know if you'd call this your place, that's totally okay. And I hope today that when you think about belonging and community, you substitute whatever communities are valuable to you in for what we're talking about today. But if we are going to talk about and use our community specifically as an example today, I would say that for me, the most important thing that happens here is relationship and community. It's not the sermons, because you can go onto your podcast app and find, I think, better sermons. It's not the jokes, right? Because as much as I appreciate your laughter, you can go onto Netflix and there's also really great comedy specials if you just want jokes, right? And again, much love to all the people who help out with our coffee team, but I know that there's other coffee shops you could go to, so I know you don't come here specifically for the coffee, right? I know that what is most important, I believe this with all my heart, what's most important is the connection. It's the community. It's the relationships, which is why my heart is always so inspired and warmed when I look around and I see people engaging with one another, when I see people staying after our gatherings, right? And maybe, you know, for those of you, I know this is first service, second service, we do a bit more discussion time after, and sometimes, you know, just people will stay, you know, long after our timer has run out, and that's great because I love the connection that is built there. I love when I hear that people meet here at Aldea and then they make plans for something outside of Aldea together. When there are people who volunteer, I notice that when you volunteer, often it creates connection because you're getting to interact with people in a different way. There's all these different possibilities. And I notice that when people connect more, that transformation follows. And I also have just tended to notice that the people who really stick around here long term are people who are in relationship with others here. But I also know that not all community is created equal. Not all community is necessarily healthy community. Because we all have been in relationships or have experienced family dynamics or even been a part of organizations or communities in which inauthenticity was how we got belonging, in which not being our full self, not being true to who we were, was how we felt safe. And in many ways, that is the opposite of true belonging. The church that I grew up in, I would call it a charismatic church, meaning there were some wild stuff happening at our services. No snakes, but pretty much anything like below snakes. You know, like people fainting and things like that, and people speaking in tongues. And so I remember one of the services I was at, we were standing up, music was going on, so we were standing up at the front of the stage, and it was one of those services where people were starting to faint, and it was intentional. Like you'd get prayed for, and then people would knock out, and we called this being slain in the spirit. Has anyone ever heard this term before? Okay. It's very irrelevant for today's, but I just thought you should know the lingo. So anyway, people, I'm looking around, people are kind of getting knocked out left and right. And someone comes up to me and they start praying for me. And all of a sudden, I start to feel this pressure on my shoulders. And I realize that he's trying to push me down so I will knock out. And after enough time, I was just tired of the struggle. So I just kind of I let myself fall and I kind of knocked out. And then, I laid down there for like 2 minutes. And I thought, okay, that's probably good. I'm going to get up again. And so I stand back up. And what do I feel? But like a minute later, that hand is back on my shoulder again. And he starts praying and he starts pulling me down again. And this happened 2 more times. And each time, I laid down, got back up. The last time I just laid down for the rest of the service because I was like, I'm not dealing with this. Now, if you have come from a church like that, I'm not discounting the fact that you might have had really positive experiences. And really, the reason I share that story is I look back now and I realize, I wanted to fit in to the moment, to the group, to what was happening in the room. And so I faked something. I did something that was inauthentic to myself. And I realized that maybe that was kind of a picture of my larger experience growing up in church, when things like doubts or tensions arose, when things didn't sit right with me. I chose to stifle those things and suppress those things rather than being authentic to myself. And I now realize that is not belonging, that is fitting in. And one of the foremost researchers on vulnerability and belonging is Brené Brown, and she makes this distinction wonderfully. She says, fitting in is about assessing a situation and becoming who you need to be in order to be accepted. Belonging, on the other hand, doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires us to be who we are. I find this distinction to be essential. Have you ever had a relationship of some kind that was built not on who you actually are, but who you thought you needed to be? A pretense of some kind? And then when that pretense fell away, when that version of you could no longer hold it up, perhaps that relationship too fell away. I've become wary of any type of relationship or community dynamic in which authenticity is a threat. And if that's something that you experience in your life, maybe just ask yourself, is this relationship, is this community dynamic serving me? Or maybe would I be freer by letting it go? I've seen this all the time in my life. I in many ways, I consider my job a professional heretic. I don't know if any of you resonate with that. If you don't know what that means, basically, when I think about the church I came from and I think about what I do now, I would be on a wanted list for a lot of the churches that I came from for what I speak about now. And so in order to make that transition, in a lot of ways, I had to I would say it's like a coming out to the world of just, how I approach spirituality. And in a lot of ways, that became well known in the communities I came from. And there were some relationships that survived that level of authenticity, and there were some that didn't. And while I wouldn't say that I'm glad that these relationships didn't survive my sense of becoming who I was, I would say that there is a letting go that happens in service of a greater authenticity. Has anyone felt this before? Sometimes what we are being invited to is bravery and risk and letting go in order to find true belonging. There are some of us here who are unsatisfied with surface belonging, right? Anyone just small talk just does not do it for you anymore? And I realize this isn't because of a lack of love. It's not because you're unwilling to do that because you just don't have love. I think it's actually because our hearts know that true and deep and authentic belonging is possible. Even if you haven't actually experienced it in your life, I think we are led by some sort of North Star of knowing that something is possible. See, I believe this community has been aiming for this. It's been this beautiful experiment for 20 plus years of a deeper, more truer form of belonging, right? And it's something that we're going to explore throughout this series, not just where we're going, but where we've been in our history in it all. if we can belong, friends, then we can become. Because if we are safe to be who we are, if we are able to be authentic, then transformation naturally follows. It's much easier to grow and expand when we are not stifling who we are, when we are given the freedom to grow. Do you have a relationship in your life where you know you are secure and safe in this relationship to change, to grow, to evolve, that this other person can hold space for you in wherever your journey takes you? Do you have that? Right? If you do, I hope that you cherish that. I hope that you feel into what that feels like to have that. And if you don't, I hope that you can find that here. And if we can belong and if we can become, then we love from a place of authenticity. I believe that we all bring love into the world in unique ways. We all have different gifts to give. We all serve in unique ways. And when we belong, that love is not an obligation. It's a natural outflow. So think about the times in your life where you knew you could show up authentically and therefore you could give the gift that only you could give. As we move through this series, there's a couple things I want us to consider. And really today, when we think about belonging, I just want to ask a couple questions. And the first is this: can you belong with yourself, right? Because if we're going to talk about belonging in community, I first want to ask, do you belong to yourself? Maybe another way of asking that is, can you be authentic? Can you be honest with yourself? Do you accept yourself? Maybe the degree to which we expect belonging from others, maybe that's somehow related to the degree in which we belong to ourselves, right? Like, how much acceptance do we expect from others while we may not even accept ourselves? Maybe acceptance from others teaches us how to accept ourselves, but that relationship with ourself is so important. French philosopher Michel de Montaigne said, "The greatest thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself." So can we belong to ourselves? And maybe if we can, maybe we can think about belonging to others, belonging with others. Can you be authentic with others? Do you let yourself be seen? There's always risk in vulnerability. But I also wonder if the degree to which we are willing to be vulnerable is the degree to which others are going to be vulnerable with us. And it's that collective, mutual vulnerability, I believe, that really creates deep and true community. Psychologist M. Scott Peck, who wrote the books Road Less Traveled and A Different Drum, he said there can be no vulnerability without risk, and there can be no community without vulnerability. And lastly, I want to ask maybe a bigger question or a more encompassing question. Do you feel that you belong here? And I don't mean Aldea. I don't mean 8800 North La Cañada Drive. I mean, do you feel as though you belong here in the universe? H-E-R-E, capital, all caps, caps lock, H-E-R-E. Do you feel that you belong in the universe? See, I think this is really one of the essential questions of human life and of spirituality. Maybe it's the question. Do I matter? Do I belong? I think you could spend a whole life answering this question. And if you're a little confused about this question today, I just want to offer a little perspective, right? Because we talk a lot here about interconnection, unity, oneness, and all of these words sound like a form of belonging, a really great form of belonging. But you might be out there and you might be wondering, are those actually real? Is it possible? Or are these just a fantasy? And for me, what I tend to find is that these words aren't a fantasy, that when adopting a new perspective, we can see that interconnection and unity and oneness are actually the truth. We just need to dig a little deeper, right? Maybe we dig into something like quantum physics, which, if you don't know much about quantum physics, it's basically the study of the smallest stuff, and then you get even smaller than that. So like whatever the smallest you can think of. And what we're basically finding is that the building blocks of all reality, of all matter, are mostly empty space, vastly mostly empty space, but there's just a little bit of energy in relationship to other energy moving so fast, creating this experience of matter. But basically, what has been found is that at the core fundamental building blocks of reality is energy in relationship. Relationship is the foundation of everything. Maybe we look at life on this planet, and though we so often forget in our modern Western world and all the technology that we have, we lose this sense of how dependent we are to the river and to the tree and to the ocean, to other animals, to other humans. We forget our dependence, but in fact, all of us are deeply interdependent to one another. Thich Nhat Hanh said, "To be is to interbe." There is no other way but to belong, but to be in community, but to be in relationship. So this idea that this is a fantasy, I think the real fantasy is that we're separate. The real fantasy is that we're isolated. And the reality is that we deeply belong. So maybe you like to use words like God or source, or maybe the universe is more comfortable for you. But we just finished this series called Perennial, talking about how there are some deep truths about being human and about spirituality that are found throughout various spiritual traditions, said differently but pointing to the same thing. And one of the perennial truths that we uncovered was that this idea that we all belong, that's the fundamental reality as said by many spiritual traditions. And the illusion is that we are separate. But in fact, friends, you have not been forgotten. You are not out of place. So when we lean into relationship, when we lean into community, what if what we are doing is actually reflecting the truth of the universe? And of course, transformation and love would follow. Only one problem with this. And the problem is that when it comes to vulnerability, when it comes to community, this can get messy. Anyone felt this before? It can get complicated, right? It can be difficult. Take this community. We are a collection of human beings. And as a collection of human beings, there are going to be natural tensions and complications that arise. One of my favorite parts about our community, one of the things that I think we're doing uniquely is that we are a spiritually diverse place. But I think that's the easy part. Right? I rarely hear people having any kind of difficulty around the spiritual diversity. But it gets a little more tricky when we talk about political diversity. It gets a little more tricky when you enter into some kind of relationship with people that you meet here and then there's hurt, there's pain. It gets a little more complicated when maybe the organization itself lets you down. Maybe a leader such as myself lets you down. And the question is, what then? What do we do in those moments? I found this to be true in my life, and I wonder if you have as well. I've found that trust and intimacy and authenticity grows not when we avoid conflict, but when we move through it together. All right, I'll say that again because I think it's so important, and it's just revealed itself to me more and more that our ability to experience the depth of community is not there in spite of the challenges, but maybe because of the challenges that we are able to move through and find our way to the other side. So yes, it's going to be hard. Yes, it's going to be uncomfortable. Yes, there's going to be messiness, but I encourage you to lean in. I'm not saying that we don't need to have boundaries, that we don't need to listen to our own needs and take care of ourselves. I'm absolutely encourage those things. But it's also just a what if question. What would it look like if instead of running away anytime something got a little difficult, if I chose to lean in? What would that level of belonging open up in my life? So maybe that looks like leaning in here in this community. Maybe there's someone you chat with after services. Maybe it's time to invite them to coffee, right? Maybe you come to a Sunday. Maybe a smaller group would be an opportunity for you to be known a little more. Or maybe you could just do with being a little more vulnerable in your relationships, right? Maybe you need to send that text that says, I'm actually not okay. Maybe you need to send that text that says, when you said that thing the other day, it actually hurt me, and I do want to talk about it. Maybe it means going deep within in your own spiritual practice and just finding the places within yourself that doesn't feel like it belongs. Maybe you don't feel like you belong to yourself. Maybe you don't feel like you belong here on this planet, in this body, in this life. And maybe the spiritual practice is noticing whatever stands in the way of that feeling of belonging and worth. Noticing, being curious, and offering love and compassion to those parts of ourselves. Friends, I want to invite us as we close today just to take a moment to center ourselves. Take a deep breath. Let your breath slow and deepen. Find a comfortable position. And I invite you in this moment to ask that question of yourself. Do I belong to myself? What comes up for me when I ask this question? Are there parts of yourself that need more acceptance? Are there things in your life that need letting go of? Are there parts of yourself that you could offer more love to? Maybe ask yourself, do I belong to others? Do I allow myself to belong to others? When things get tough, do I isolate? How much vulnerability am I offering to those in my life? And what kind of bravery and courage would be required to reach the kind of authenticity that I know I want for my life? And lastly, do I feel that I belong here as part of the community of life? Do I feel that I matter? That I am a sacred and beloved part of something greater than myself, and I am loved? Maybe take a moment to have gratitude for those times in your life where you experienced a false sense of belonging or a surface level belonging, and the moments that you had courage to move past those moments, to move beyond those spaces, to let go in order to achieve a greater authenticity in your life. And if in any way, shape, or form that you felt this morning that you belong, that you felt belonging here in this room, that you felt known, that you felt seen, that you felt accepted, just take a moment and have some gratitude for whatever that moment was, for whatever person that moment might have come through. And we remind ourselves that this level of belonging, it's not a fluke. It's actually how things really are and what our lives are meant